Welcome. I said welcome. All right. All right. First of all, I'm told to remind all of you to turn off your phone, to silence your phone. Part of the ethos of modern technology that we actually have to remind people of doing that. First of all, my name is Sze-kar. I'm the professor of New Testament here at Perkins School of Theology. I send all of you the warmest greetings from our Dean, Craig Hill, Dr. Craig Hill, who is out of the country at the moment. Now, he has supported this event from the start, for which we are grateful. I am grateful. In addition, I want to make mention of the support of the SMU Tower Center Sun and Star Program on Japan and East Asia, and also the SMU Center for Faith and Learning, without their support, this forum would not be possible either. The SMU Embry Human Rights Program is also a co-sponsor of this conversation. The protests happening on the streets of Hong Kong almost on a daily basis have captivated the world's attention. These protests raise important questions about social movement, politics, even geopolitics, especially in light of the trade war between the US and China. But what intrigues me, selfishly, as a theological scholar, is in fact the religious dimensions of these protests. Christians take on leadership roles in these protests, and many churches have opened their doors to protesters as sanctuaries, which is, of course, an honored tradition in the biblical narrative. In that regard, we're very fortunate tonight to have with us Dr. Gong Lap Yan in Cantonese, a theologian with a front row seat to the protests, who will share with us a talk very provocatively titled, A Secular/Theological Messianic Exegesis of the Anti-Extradition Bill Protests in Hong Kong. It's a daring title, and I have a lot of questions to ask him as a theological scholar. Now, two of SMU's finest, by that I don't mean just the uniformed colleagues outside these stores. I include them, but I also include Dr. Hiroki Takeuchi and Dr. Matthew Wilson, who are political scientists, both of them. They will serve as discussants. They will help us make sense of the political and perhaps even the international dimensions of the Hong Kong protests, respectively from the perspective of East Asia and also from the perspective of the United States. Now, before we begin, let me belabor something that might be obvious already. This forum is a scholarly discussion within the context of an institution of higher learning. We're not, and I repeat, we're not conducting a political rally. We're not trying to convert you to our positions, if we have any positions. Of course, if we get two Perkins faculty together, you get about 5 or 6 different positions. And they may all, in fact, be self-contradictory. Our aim, now as always, is to help SMU and the intellectual community in general to learn more about ourselves and about the world, to reflect deeply on events around us, and perhaps, just perhaps, even to make us a little bit skeptical about what we think we know. It is always interesting to disabuse your students or your audience of what they think they know or what you yourself think that you know. Our speaker and panelists have their own distinct points of view and their own deeply held convictions that do not necessarily represent Perkins or SMU's. The invitation we extend to them to take part in this forum carries no guarantee that we must agree with their positions or, for that matter, they must subscribe to ours. We are scholars. It is our job to disagree with one another. After the presentation by our speaker and by our discussants, we will have ample time for questions and answers. And I encourage all of us to raise your questions, to make use of that time for a free but orderly exchange of ideas. So all of us could in fact learn from you as well. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Gong Lap-Yan Kong, is professor of systematic theology at the Chinese University of Hong Kong Divinity School. His research interests carry him into the fields of political theology, ethics, even practical theology. He's a prolific writer, having published scholarly books and journal articles in his fields of expertise. A partial list of his publications are already on the flyer, so I'm not going to repeat all of that. But I do want to highlight his award-winning book, translated as A Tearless Grief, which in fact has the original Chinese title, 抹不乾的眼淚, 抹不乾的眼淚, literally, tears that cannot be wiped away. This is a book, in fact, he wrote after his wife's passing. As I was reading his book, I was so deeply moved, I kept on thinking about C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed, if you know that book. He is an international traveler, working with philosophers and theologians from Czech Republic, Poland, Germany, and as I said, he's a front-row observer of the Hong Kong protests. Dr. Lap-Yan Kong is uniquely qualified to help us reflect on the tumultuous events that are unfolding in Hong Kong, even as we gather here, because of the time difference. Dr. Kong?
Thank you. Thank you very much. It is my honor to be invited to come here. People ask me whether I have any jet lag. I say no, because before coming to Dallas, I spent a few days in New York to attend another conference. So I fly over there, and fortunately, I escaped the tornado. Anyway, I arrived safely here. So thank you very much again, giving me this opportunity to share with you. Okay, now the theme that I am given about 20 to 25 minutes. I hope that I will keep the time, finish my presentation. So the theme that I'm going to share with you is talking about a secular theological Messianic exegesis of anti-extradition bill protests. Okay. Well, perhaps it is good for me to give you the thesis, what I'm going to say in the next 20 minutes. Either you fall into sleep, or maybe when I'm speaking in tongue, other than in English, at least you know what I'm going to say. My thesis is, like most political movements, anti-extradition bill protests in Hong Kong have carried a certain extent of Messianic components, but they are secular and have had a lot of limitations and defects. Theology thus can complement or challenge the ongoing protests in four ways, in order that the secular Messianic nature of the protest would be appropriately received. First, God as the Lord of history, reflected in Jesus, persuade us that sovereign should be understood as a power to sustain, not to announce the stage of exception. Second, Jesus as a crucified Messiah provides us a lens to interpret protesters as suffering messiahs. It is not a call of martyrdom, but a call for solidarity. Third, the church as a Messianic community characterized by inclusiveness, forgiveness, truth, and unity provides an alternative other than politics identity. And the final, the already not yet nature of the Messianic community, going with like water, I would say something about this, is always a resistance in terms of hidden transcript to public transcript. So this is my thesis. Hopefully, I can explain it more clearly in the coming 20 minutes. First of all, I would like to show you some of the pictures here. I'm sure that you can see all these pictures either from the TV or from the newspaper, even from the internet. The first one picture is the valley, is a demonstration in Hong Kong. People carrying the umbrella because it is raining. Okay, it's not because of the umbrella movement. We have to bring the umbrella with us all the time. But during the time of the protest, it is important for the demonstrators to carry umbrella with them because it is to prevent the paper spread from the police. And another picture then is a kind of copying the Lenin Wall in Prague. Okay, so you know about the Lenin Wall. So it's talking about the dream, something like that. So that's what we are copying such kind of ideas in Hong Kong. And the people can write something on this stick paper, after writing something, either some kind of blessing, some kind of hope, and stick on the wall. Okay, so that is happening in Hong Kong. And then the final picture that I would like to show you, that is another kind of non-violence approach of the people. We are learning something from Baltic state. During the time in August 1989, 3 states of the Baltic state, they were practicing human chain. About 2 million of the people, they joined together to ask for democracy. So this is also what Hong Kong is doing. Okay, just to give you some example idea of the demonstration in Hong Kong. And then another picture that I also would like to show you. So this, the first one picture is the tear gas by the police in Hong Kong. So until we have the demonstration, until right now lasts for 4 months, about more than 2,000 tear gas was used. Okay, so to give you some of the pictures. And then another picture is the demonstrator carrying with a helmet, with different kind of equipments. So that is the equipments what the demonstrator only have. So we do not have guns, we do not have stake, we have a helmet, we have an umbrella, and also glasses to protect our eyes. Okay. And the final picture then you can see here, because the demonstrators now are getting used to the tear gas shot by the police. So sometimes some of the protesters, they carry the tennis racket, okay, to bounce back the tear gas back to the police. So just give you some of the picture to feel what's been happening in the last 4 months in Hong Kong. Now, let me give you a very brief idea of what is going on in Hong Kong and also the reasons and the causes behind the protests in Hong Kong, because some of you may not fully know what's going on. But because of the limitation of time, I'm not able to give you a very comprehensive and detailed pictures. I just highlight some of the points here. Now, the first one is when we are talking about the demonstration in Hong Kong. The government explained that the proposal of the amendments to the extradition law is to respond to the murder case in Taiwan, because there is no extradition arrangement between Hong Kong and Taiwan. So that is the original reason leading to such kind of amendment. And this is fine to the people in Hong Kong, but the government proposed saying that it also extends to China. So in other words, that there is no extradition exchange between Hong Kong and China. But once this bill is passed, it will apply to China as well. So in other words, that if someone have committed something wrong or crime in China, and if he or she comes to Hong Kong, he or she and the police in Hong Kong can arrest him or her and send him or her back to China. So that is the most concern about the people in Hong Kong. This threatened the people of Hong Kong because the firewall between China mainland and Hong Kong would be destroyed. And also human rights of the people of Hong Kong would not be protected. Okay, so that is the reason behind here. So on June 9, 2019, more than 1 million of people joined the demonstration, demanding the government to withdraw the bill. But the government refused it, and on the evening on the same day, it announced that the second reading of the bill would go ahead on schedule on June 12th. Now, the first big demonstration, we have about 1 million of the people. And the total population of Hong Kong is 7.5 million. So you can calculate about the percentage. Okay. And then on June 12th, a serious clash between police and protesters led to the cancellation of the Legislative Council meeting, even though the government proposed to have the second reading of the bill, but it was not successful because the building was blocked by the demonstrators, so that the legislators were not able to enter into the Legislative Council chamber to hold the meeting. And on June 15, the government finally announced to suspend the bill, but it was not accepted by the people because we are talking about to withdraw the bill. We are not talking about to suspend it. You know, when you say suspend it, that means maybe after few months, you put forward once again. So on June 16, another big rally was held in Hong Kong. It had 2 million plus 1 people. Maybe you are very curious why there's plus 1. Because one demonstrator was suicide for the sake of the democracy and freedom in Hong Kong. So that's why we always have to remember this guy. So that's why we say 2 million plus 1. So that one here is to remember the one who died for the sake of democracy in Hong Kong. So although the clash between the police and protesters was accelerating, the protesters in Hong Kong mostly still consider that the police were scapegoat. But since the gang attack on ordinary people on July 21st, which is just that they had the permission from the police, the remaining trust on police had been completely vanished. Okay, so there's something happened on July 21st. Ordinary people, after they joined the demonstration, they took the train and returned home. They were beaten by these white shirt people. And in fact, we have a lot of information saying that the police know beforehand there are some people going to attack the ordinary people, but the police didn't do anything to stop them. And we have evidence to believe that there is some kind of cooperation between them, because maybe if the police are not able to beat the demonstrator, the best way is to find a gang to do it on their behalf. Okay. So now we are talking about the 5 demands from the protesters. The first one is talking about the withdrawal of the bill. Finally, the government withdrew it on September 1st, almost 3 months later. Now we are talking about the withdrawal of the bill. This is something related to the value of rule of law. Okay, so we are talking about the rule of law. And then setting up an independent investigation commission to examine police brutality. And the police strongly against it. And the whole issue here is talking about the transparency of governance. Okay, just to let you know, when we are talking about this demand, there are some values behind. The values, the first one, we are talking about the rule of law instead of rule by law. We are talking about the transparency of governance. And the third one, we are talking about a demand of universal suffrage. So this is talking about the right of participation as well as a just social structure. And the final two is talking about retracting the classification of protesters as rioters and also amnesty for arrested protesters. So these are the 5 demands of the people in Hong Kong. And there is a note I would like to draw your attention. In these 5 demands coming from the protester, there is nothing about the Chinese government. You can see it from here. It is very clear. It is nothing about the government, about the Chinese government. It is nothing about talking about the independence of Hong Kong. It is not talking. We are talking about the universal suffrage. That is guaranteed in the basic law. Okay? And also the Chinese government promised to implement this, but in accordance with their time frame. Okay, so I just want to let you know that is the reality here. But how is the local issue become a national issue now? That is another issue here. Now, the Chinese government condemned the protest as something called the independent movement in August 2019. This kind of condemnation is not something new to Hong Kong. During the time of the Umbrella Movement in 2014, the Chinese government also condemned this is an independent movement, or the government would use the word, it's a color revolution. Okay, something like that. Okay, and the second thing I also would like to let you know is that the experience of the people in Hong Kong, we feel that we are forced to be integrated into China's dream. Now, take an example here. When we are talking about high-speed rail in Hong Kong is so small, we do not need to have something called a high-speed rail. But we spend a huge amount of money for this. And also because of building such kind of high-speed rail, it also damaged the environment deeply, you know. And then what do then people in Hong Kong, we ask, why do we need to have such kind of high-speed rail in Hong Kong? The only one reason that we know, because it is to fulfill the China's dream, and also manifested in what we call one belt, one road. And then we have to ask whether Hong Kong is for China or Hong Kong is for the people in Hong Kong. So making also people in Hong Kong feel, you know, not very happy with the Chinese government. And the final one that I would like to draw your attention here, the Chinese government violently intervenes Hong Kong by disqualifying the status of legislators who question the legitimacy of the Chinese government. So in other words, that if you are elected by the people, then the director of the election officer, you know, will ask you whether you are supporting the Chinese government. If you are hesitate to say this, then you will be disqualified. And this is something we found, the people in Hong Kong found that this is something unfair. And also, just a recent example I also want to show you here. During the time of the protest, one pilot of Cathay Pacific, I do not know whether you have taken this airlines or not, you know, one pilot of the Cathay Pacific speak openly to support the protest, and also some stewards also say something like that. And the Chinese government requests the Cathay Pacific to submit the names of those who say yes to the protest to the Chinese government. Otherwise, Cathay Pacific would not be allowed to fly over China. Then you know Hong Kong is part of China. If you are not allowed to fly over, that means you can't do any business. So what should Cathay Pacific do? The chief executive of the Cathay Pacific resigned. Even though he resigned, it doesn't help to solve the issue. The new executive just submit the name to the Chinese government and fire the pilots and also other staffs. So that's why we are talking about, is it right for the people, no matter what kind of jobs that you are doing, you can have the freedom to express what you think, okay? But that is something is not allowed in Hong Kong. So that's why we say it's a kind of intervention. So that's why in the later stage of the protest development, some of the discontent, not just only on the Hong Kong government, but also on the Chinese government. So that's the background that I would like to draw your attention here. Now I'm going to talk to the contents of my presentation here. I still know that I do not have much time left. You know, I hope that I can finish it within 10 minutes, something like that. Okay. Now the first idea is talking about the sovereign and the power to suspend. Now, if sovereign is understood as the one who can declare the state of exception, suggested by Carl Smith, the government is definitely the sovereign. But the people in Hong Kong, or I call the Hong Kongers, experience a different experience of sovereign. In other words, that the people in Hong Kong, they no longer live in the borrowed time and space. They are the people of this land. We are not only the people to be ruled by the government. We are the people of this land. We have a different understanding of a sovereign here. Land and walls are set up here in different places in different regions, in the everyday life of the people. If I use the idea of Henry Lefebvre's, he is a sociologist talking about the idea of space. According to what he said, a real revolution is found in the participation of the reconstruction of space. Henry Lefebvre is a Marxist. He is not talking about the change of the social structures. It is important, but the most important is the change of the space. We are participating into the change of the space. So this means the people in Hong Kong, we found that we are the owner of this land. We also have the right to participate into the reproduction of our space. Okay, so this is our experience. Now, when we talk about the theology, when we're talking about the experience of the sovereign God here, when we say the Lord of history is about God as sovereign, then we are talking here as the freedom and the right to announce the time of judgment and salvation. So when we are talking about God as the Lord of history, we are not talking about Lord is guiding my future, but we are talking about God as sovereign. He has the freedom to make the time for the judgment and salvation. That is exactly what Carl Smith talked about, sovereign as the one who can announce the stage of exception. Okay, so that is the same idea as what Carl Smith is talking about. But Jesus said, his kingdom is not of this world. He exercised his sovereign by suspending law and order. That is to say, he does not obey the Roman law. He does not obey the Jewish law. Because when we say the sovereign, we are not only the sovereign to suspend, to announce the stage of exception, but Jesus is also the one to sustain the law, the relevant, the legitimacy of the law. So this is what I call the power of analogia. That is talking about the potentiality. Now, its implication for us is that Hong Kongers experience their sovereign within one country, two system, by the power to sustain. We are not, even though we are still within the framework of one country, two system, but the people in Hong Kong, we can still experience the sovereign, even though such kind of sovereign is very different from the government. But our experience of sovereign, because we have the power to sustain, we have also the power to say that we do not need to listen to what you have said. We also have the power to say no to some of the rules and regulations that is violating the justice and human rights. Okay, so that is the understanding here. Okay, now the second idea is talking about the suffering Messiah. According to Hannah Arendt, she said, every newborn creates something new. They are the people challenging the status quo and also the logic of causation. Their coming, the newborn, the coming, is a kairos. The kairos that do not guarantee the future, but at least they open up possibilities. Now in the Hong Kong right now, 700 out of nearly 2,400 arrested are aged under 18. Okay, many of them, they are young people. And they will face the further charge of rioting, and the maximum sentence is 10 years. And the young people said, we are chosen by the generation, not because we are privileged, but because we do not avoid the responsibility of our times. So they are taking up the responsibility of being the Messiah of our times. Not because they are more superior than the old guy like us or like me, but because people like me, we avoid taking up the responsibility. And the young guy, they take up the responsibility of our times. I just showed you some of the pictures here. On the right-hand side, you can see they are the secondary students. Well, in Hong Kong, most of the school, we do wear uniform, school uniform. You can see the girls here, they kneel down and also talking about 5 demands. And then you see another girls here, they are talking about, there is a picture of human chain here, and also a young girl, sitting in front of the police, stopping the police to go forward, to do something else. Okay, so just give you the picture. The young people, they play a very important role in Hong Kong. And according to the Christian understanding, we are talking about the messiahs, but we are talking about the suffering messiahs. Now here, I do not have any intention to romanticize the Messiah of the young people. Because from a theological perspective, messiahs are suffering. They are not to be glorified. So that is the experience of the Christian understanding of messiahs. A theological messiah idea is saying that for until us a child is born. Jesus is the crucified Messiah. He died for the sake of the whole creation. At the same time, his death has revealed the brutality of the power. Death is not the final word, but resurrection. Resurrection is to denounce the brutality of power. And the implication is that the face of the suffering messiahs unmasks the structural violence and the police abuse of power. I just want to tell you that at the very beginning, not many middle-aged people or old people, they will support the protests in Hong Kong. But once they have seen the young people being arrested, being beaten by the police, many of the old guys change our mind, saying that we should come out to protect our young people. They change the whole ideas here because the young people, they are for us. In terms of Emmanuel Levinas, he is talking about the face of the others. The face of the suffering messiahs retrieves our humanity and calls us to protect them free from police violence. Now the third one is talking about a Messianic community and the politics identity. Politic identity is used as a tool to frame political claims, promote political ideologies, or stimulate and orient social and political action, usually in a larger context of inequality or injustice, and with the aim of asserting group distinctiveness and belonging and gaining power and recognition. So that is what we are talking about, the politics identity. According to Charles Taylor, social imaginary is something much broader and deeper than intellectual screams people may entertain when they think about reality is in this engaged mode. I'm thinking rather of the ways people imagine their social existence, how they fit together with each other, how things go on between them and their fellows, the expectations that they are normally met, and the deeper normative notions and the images that underlie these expectations. A parent-child metaphor of social imaginary of one country to system is no longer able to explain and sustain the relationship between Chinese government and Hong Kongers. I do not have time to go in details here. I just want to let you know that the current social imaginary is no longer work. And therefore, there is a need of the emergence of the new social imaginary. That is what we are talking about, politics identity here. Now, I just give you 4 pictures here. Well, it's a very interesting one. So this is the Lion Walk. Okay, it's a mountain called the Lion Walk. The top one here is a picture taken in the 1970s or 1980s. And the pictures here, you can see it, well, if you have been in Hong Kong, you will know it, is a picture taken from the south and looking to the north. So that's why the first picture shows us that the people in Hong Kong in 1960 or 70 up to 1980s, we still have a dream to return to our homeland because China is in the north of Hong Kong. I don't know what, because I cannot give into the detailed arguments here. But now, in the last few years, when we took the pictures of Lion Walk, there's something changed. We no longer take the picture coming from the south to the north, but from a different perspective to look at the Lion Rock. For instance, like the picture here is talking, we need authentic universal suffrage. We do not want to have a fake one. So the Lion Rock is not just only a barrier helping the people in Hong Kong wanting to be back to their homeland, but Lion Rock now belongs to the people of Hong Kong. And the second one, so is a Lady of Liberty. So that is the image of the of the poster, and the demo is a huge one. You know, I think about 12 feet high, and the demonstrator bring it. You know, put it in the top of the mountain. Okay, and the last one is the human chain. When they do it, they open their mobile with the light to show this. Okay, so the meaning of the Lion Rock has been changed. I just want to give you some more pictures to know the change of the social imaginary here. Okay, so the Lion Rock, you know, and then I do not want to go into details here. So on September 20, a global web, so under Global Times, the Chinese government social media criticized Hong Kong churches. Okay, so there are a lot of criticism here, so I do not want to go into details here. A Messianic community, when we are talking about theology, Oscar Romero says, a church that suffers no persecution, but enjoys the privileges and support of the things of the earth, beware, is not the true church of Jesus Christ. So once the churches is criticized by the Chinese government, I'm not quite sure, but for me, I'm so happy. Oh, yes, now it's the time for the churches to be criticized. At least we know we are in solidarity with the people of Hong Kong. So the churches is a conscience of society characterized by true forgiveness, peace, and reconciliation. And it helps to support the development of a new social imaginary about the people in Hong Kong. The new imaginary, I would say, it is something about living on the edge, even on the periphery. Okay, coming to the last two slide here. Already, but not yet, and like water, you know, I do not know how many of you here know Bruce Lee, you know, but people are always expecting that, you know, people coming from China or from Hong Kong, we know Kung Fu, but unfortunately we don't. Even though my name is Kung, but I do not have Fu. I'm a Fu, but not Kung Fu, you know. Anyway, so it's talking about be water here, okay? So the be water is talking about a way of attacking, not withdrawal, belief in power of water and something. Okay, you can read it here. And then living in the tension. That is the theology, already but not yet. No matter how powerful the public transcript is, it is not the realized eschatology. The Messianic community is a hidden transcript. It is a resistance to public transcript and always carry a sense of hope. So that is the understanding by James Scott. Christian, witness to a life living with dignity in an unfavorable social condition. So these are happening right now in China. Not only in China, but also in different parts of the world. So implications here, according to the Chinese understanding, the Taoism, you know, the highest goodness is like water. So I would say we have to think about from a focus on strategy to a way of life, from a focus on defeating enemies to a capacity to embrace the differences. Liu Xiaobo, 2010 Nobel Peace Prize. He said, I have no enemies. So if you have time, you can go to the link and read the statement made by Liu Xiaobo. I have no enemies. So that is talking about like water. From a focus on enhancing one's bargaining power to discover and appreciate the power of the so-called weakness. We are weak, but we are not powerlessness. So that is the whole idea of hidden transcript here. So that is in Chinese calligraphy here. Okay. The final one, what is the future? A lot of the people is asking. The possibility is, the first one is the protester demands are met, especially setting up an independent inquiry commission. Option 2, the Chinese government send troops to Hong Kong. Well, it doesn't solve the problem, but they will do it anyway. I do not know. And the third option is introducing curfew or martial law in Hong Kong. And the fourth one is let the protests develop and lose the public support. They are all the options. We are not quite sure. But I would say the emergence of an emergent community featured by suffering but experience suffering and solidarity. Injustice, but witnessing to a life of death, I have no enemies, may be the core values of the emergent community that is developing right now in Hong Kong. So thank you very much. I spend more time than I'm given. Thank you.
I have a lot of questions, but we'll resolve our theological differences over a beer or something. Suffice to say that actually Bruce Lee and I went to the same high school in Hong Kong. He's much older than I am, so please don't put me in the same category. Our first respondent is Dr. Hiroki Takeuchi, who's professor of political science at SMU, after teaching at UCLA and Stanford, the so-called Harvard of the West. Dr. Takeuchi is the director of the Sun and Star program on Japan and East Asia on the Tower Center at SMU. His research interests include Chinese and Japanese politics, comparative political economy of authoritarian regimes, and international relations of East Asia, as well as applying, this is I find interesting, game theory to political science. He's the author of numerous articles, but his most representative publications include his book, Tax Reform in Rural China, Revenue, Resistance, and Authoritarian Rule, and a book he co-authors, with two other colleagues, Taiwan at a Turning Point. But let me just add one more thing. His plane landed at DFW at 8:30 this morning, and 10 hours later, he's right here speaking to us. My good friend, Hiroki.
Well, Sze-kar, thank you very much for a kind introduction. One thing he didn't say is my plane arrived from Tokyo.
Oh.
So that was like after 12-hour flight.
Thank you. That was the most important part.
Well, first of all, I'm not theologian, so I talk about the political aspect of the Hong Kong protest today. And to me, Hong Kong protest was interesting as a political scientist because I have written a book about political economy of rural China, and when I wrote a book about political economy of rural China, I wrote about a lot of protests in rural China. So the first time when I was observing Hong Kong protests this time, I compare the Hong Kong protests with numerous rural protests in China, which I have been familiar with. And interesting thing is, of course, Hong Kong is one country, two systems. And the point is which side comes to the front, right? So, and then so far, I say some like a positive aspect. It seems that the Hong Kong police is following two-system part. Because if really Hong Kong police follows the pattern of the police in mainland China, it would be much more brutal. So there are a lot of the criticism against Hong Kong police, and then that's actually legitimate criticism. But at the same time, actually, usually the Chinese Communist Party suppresses the protest in mainland China. It would be much more brutal. Having said that, one of the fundamental mechanisms of current Hong Kong protest is since Xi Jinping became president in 2013, basically Xi Jinping's policy is pushing one country more rather than emphasizing two systems. And people in Hong Kong basically overall don't like it. So that's actually the fundamental mechanism of the current Hong Kong protest. So I said the police response in Hong Kong is much less brutal than the police response in mainland China. But actually, the Hong Kong protest is actually more difficult problem for Xi Jinping than many of the protests in rural China. One is in rural China, protesters are mainly protesting against local governments. So central government usually uses it as solving the problem. And then their demand is usually economic rather than challenge for regime, demand for democratization. I mention this because currently more and more demand for Hong Kong protest is for demand of the democratization. And then that is actually Xi Jinping administration really doesn't want to and then also will not respond, will not listen to. So today I want to emphasize the fundamental problems in the political economy of Hong Kong that actually makes the current protest really complicated. But a few things that I'd like to mention before concluding this my commentary. So one is actors. So we often talk about Hong Kong police, and we also worry about Beijing may use their military. But between the Hong Kong police and Chinese military called People's Liberation Army, called PLA, there is one important actor called the People's Armed Police, in Chinese called Wujing. And they are actually the police, and then, but it's a mainland police, but they are also more armed than regular police. And so the question is whether and when mainland China or Beijing uses People's Armed Police, PAP, rather than relying on Hong Kong police. That's actually one question. And then if Beijing needs to escalate the suppression, then they may use PLA. The reason that we really worry about the use of PLA is it will remind us of what happened in 1989 in Tiananmen Square. And that was the suppression of the democratization movement. Well, we can be perhaps optimistic because now China's role in the world is different from 1989. Well, Hong Kong is just 3% of the GDP of People's Republic of China. However, most of the financial transactions are through, for international trade, are through Hong Kong. So I don't think it's likely that the Beijing will choose the option of what the regime did in 1989 for Tiananmen suppression, but hopefully that will not happen. At the same time, one thing that we have to keep in mind is in Beijing's mind or in Xi Jinping's mind, democratization is not an acceptable option. So, so if the protesters' endpoint is the democratization of Hong Kong, that will be actually we will find the problem to be very difficult. So which means we may not find the endpoint. So toward the end, I'd like to talk about one fundamental problem in the political economy of Hong Kong. So that is actually what people call in Chinese the Di Chuan Ba Quan. So that is real estate hegemony. So real estate hegemony. So Hong Kong's land is owned by a few real estate developers, and then they are developing the land, and then that has brought the prosperity to Hong Kong. And then, but at the same time, that has created inequality in Hong Kong. And then Hong Kong is a typical laissez-faire government, so as a result, it is very difficult to adjust inequality by a social welfare policy. That's actually the contradiction, political economic contradiction that Hong Kong has. And then those real estate developers really basically are together with, sometimes colluding with Beijing government. And then governing Hong Kong. And that was actually the basic mechanism of one country, two systems. And then current protest shows the contradiction that one country, two systems has had since the beginning in 1997. So I usually say that there is an inequality, a mathematical inequality in Hong Kong. That is politics and economics at the left-hand side. And then that is politics plus economics is bigger than public. So that's what has happened in Hong Kong. So the politics represents central government, is Beijing, and Hong Kong government. And then economics represents businesses, especially real estate developers. They are together at the left-hand side of the equation or inequality. And then they are much larger than the public. So this is actually the fundamental contradiction of Hong Kong. And then, so what should we do? Well, I'm not a theologian, but a political scientist. So I'm going to the actor, one of the interesting actors that represents that inequality. That is Mr. Li Ka-shing. Probably that's actually, you can say, the richest person in Hong Kong. Again, of course, he is the representative real estate developer. And he actually he publicized the advertisement in August this year with the name called 一个香港市民, which means one of the residents of Hong Kong. Well, he is not just one of the Hong Kong residents, but he called himself one of the Hong Kong residents. And he wrote 最好的因可成最坏的果, which means that the best intention may lead to the worst outcome. And then he said, 爱自由, 爱包容, 爱法治, 爱中国, 爱香港, 爱自己, which means love freedom, love tolerance, love rule of law, love China, love Hong Kong, love yourself. Well, so it sounds like it's very abstract, right? So, but interesting thing is that some people, some smart people, show like some hidden message of Li Ka-shing. If you pick up some of the characters of what I have just said, then combine, change some sequence of the words, it could say, 因国有国, 荣港治己, which means the cause of the outcome is the state. And the Hong Kong people should be allowed to govern themselves. And then now it seems that somebody who was in the left-hand side, so the business tycoon, is talking about public interest. And then perhaps this may be the source of the hope that we can see right now in Hong Kong. Thank you.
Our second discussant is also a political scientist. Dr. Matthew Wilson is director of the Center for Faith and Learning and associate professor of political science at SMU. He is also a senior fellow of the John Tower Center for Public Policy and International Affairs, and also of the Italian Institute of International Political Studies. His research focuses on public opinion, elections, representations, and the role of race and religion in politics. He crunches numbers. I mean, that's the important thing, both in the United States and also abroad. We can't do it, but he can actually help us out quantitatively. He's the author and co-author of numerous books, and I'll just name one very important one here, and that is Understanding American Politics. And the second book is, in fact, Politics and Religion in the United States, and dozens of articles and essays. His contribution tonight is, in fact, entitled A Shining City on a Hill, ? Morality, Values, and American Response to the Hong Kong Protests. Matthew?
So first of all, let me assure you that despite that introduction, there will be no math required for tonight's presentation. There will have been no numbers crunched or harmed in the framing of these remarks. But the other thing that I'll say is that, like my colleague, Professor Takeuchi, I am also not trained as a theologian. However, I have considerably less intellectual humility than Professor Takeuchi, so I will venture a little bit into the theological domain in my remarks. Although I'm going to talk principally about some of the political challenges, but I will hit on some theological themes as well. Because what I really want to focus on is the tension in challenge in framing a response to the Hong Kong protests from the American vantage point. And I want to talk principally about that from the American political vantage point, but also from the standpoint of churches, and particularly Western churches, as Western Christians look at and think about the Hong Kong protests and consider what their response might be. So let's talk first of all about this from the standpoint of American foreign policy and American foreign policy decision makers. And I would say what's really at issue here in contemplating how to respond to what's going on in Hong Kong is a perennial tension in American foreign policy that exists from very deep and very long-lasting in American history. And that is the tension and the trade-off between a realpolitik, or a realistic American foreign policy rooted in pragmatic interest, versus a politics driven by morality and idealism. That has been a trade-off that has been debated in American foreign policy and America's international approach from the very beginning of this nation. I would remind you that from the very founding era of America, the colonies here were described as a shining city on a hill. That's a phrase that comes from John Winthrop, founding the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It, of course, did not originate with John Winthrop. It originated with a deeper theologian named Jesus Christ. But Winthrop quoted Jesus in talking about the Massachusetts Bay Colony, his vision of this settlement in America as a shining city on a hill. The idea that what happened in this country, what happened in this new society, in his conception, this new Jerusalem, would in fact be a model and a light unto the world, that it would be a model that others would follow. Now, he intended this in a very explicitly Christian context, right? He talked about this Massachusetts Bay Colony as being a model of Christian morality and Christian community for the world. Now, in the course of American history, this notion has been somewhat secularized. And the idea has become that America has a unique responsibility in the world to promote and to model democratic values, human rights, the full range of participation and democratic norms that undergird a functioning democratic society. This has been a recurrent notion for leaders and politicians across the partisan spectrum. This is not a Republican idea or a Democratic idea. It is something that figures in the rhetoric of politicians from John F. Kennedy to Ronald Reagan, that very much undergirds the foreign policy of leaders from Woodrow Wilson to George W. Bush. It has been a recurrent bipartisan theme that America has a special role to play in the world in promoting and modeling democracy and a free society. Now, of course, it's difficult at times to figure out what that means in practice. How does one model and promote democracy and a free society? And also, we have to be careful because that notion can take on elements of arrogance and imperialism. And it has at times in history, okay? There are certainly people around the world who hear Americans talk in those terms and say, you know what, you can keep your democracy and your political ideals and you can just, good luck with all that in your own society. We're doing just fine. But that is not always the response around the world. I think it was extremely telling. For myself, as an American, it was powerful and moving to see the images from Hong Kong of protesters waving American flags. Now, what does that say to those of us who are Americans? That people in Hong Kong would take up American flags as part of their protest. They didn't wave Canadian flags. They didn't wave Swedish flags. They didn't wave Indian flags. Those are all functioning democratic societies. Perhaps in some ways functioning better than ours, but that's a whole other question, right? But it was American flags that the protesters in Hong Kong took up, which suggests that whatever problems we may face in our polity, and there are some serious ones, that there is this powerful, enduring ideal of America as a moral symbol for democracy and freedom that people in this crucible of protest appealed to. Some would say that imposes a pretty serious moral obligation on the United States. If people in Hong Kong are clearly calling out for American involvement, it poses a real challenge in terms of what we should do. But let me say that that kind of moral, idealistic-driven American foreign policy is juxtaposed to a foreign policy that would be rooted in much more pragmatic American interests. And some might argue that as much as we might sympathize with the democratic aims of protesters in Hong Kong, the United States has serious business to do in China. And getting too involved with Hong Kong imperils the business that the United States has to do in China. That's the realpolitik argument that says it's all well and good to support the people of Hong Kong's aspirations for democratization. But at the end of the day, Hong Kong, compared to the People's Republic of China, is tiny. It doesn't have the military power. It doesn't have the wealth. It doesn't have, the influence in world affairs. And so therefore that argument would be that, look, the shining city on the hill stuff is nice, but the United States needs to engage with China. And if the United States is seen by China to be playing a disruptive role in Hong Kong, we won't be able to do that. And so this would be the countervailing caution to say, the United States needs to take a low-key role here. This seems to have been the advice thus far heeded by President Trump. President Trump has not wanted to engage. He certainly hasn't condemned the protesters in Hong Kong, but he has not wanted to respond to their implicit invitation to speak out, to engage on behalf of the United States. He seems much more inclined towards the realpolitik approach to this question, which, by the way, is fairly characteristic of his approach to a lot of foreign policy questions around the world. Right? This is at the same time that he's withdrawing from Syria and saying we need to be done with these endless wars. There's a more isolationist strain, a less idealistic strain in Trump's approach to international affairs than we've seen from some previous presidents. And you may agree or disagree with that, but it certainly marks a different strand of American foreign policy. Let me quickly speak to this from the standpoint of churches as they look at the moral dimensions of this. And Professor Kung raised the involvement of churches in Hong Kong and the fact that the Chinese government is quite suspicious of the role that churches are playing in motivating the Hong Kong protests. There certainly is an inclination on the part of many Western churches to speak up in favor of democracy and human rights in China. This, by the way, is an inclination that goes beyond simply the question of Hong Kong. Western churches would like to speak up about the Uyghurs. They'd like to speak up about Tibet. They'd like to talk about Hong Kong. None of these issues, by the way, are things that the government in Beijing wants to hear about from Western churches, or from anyone in the West for that matter, right? Making statements on these issues is not popular. Now the churches too face a dilemma, because one strand of thought would say, speak truth to power, be a bold moral witness, and let the chips fall where they may. But that's easier to say if you're speaking from outside the situation than if, for example, you are a Christian in China, who, if Western churches become politicized in the view of the Chinese government, this can make life much more difficult for Chinese Christians. Can make the Chinese much more suspicious of Christianity and the role that Christians might play in Chinese society. So there are costs that could be borne on the ground by Christians in China if Western churches are too politically active. The view of the Chinese government and of many in the Western world would be to say, churches should stay out of politics, okay? Christianity is growing in China. Both Protestant and Catholic Christianity have made substantial inroads into the Chinese population. And as Christianity grows in China, it will do so more rapidly and with less opposition from the government if it doesn't get involved in political questions, if it doesn't talk about these controversial issues. On the other hand, many Christian theologians, one in particular who comes to mind is the Christian theologian Karl Barth. He famously said, there is no such thing as a non-political Christianity, right? So his argument was that there can be no such thing, that Christianity is inherently by its very nature political. Of course, the Chinese government would say, and that's why it's dangerous, and that's why we don't want any part of it, right? So this is the dilemma. Speak truth to power. Should the churches speak truth boldly? Speak up for democracy, human rights, ethnic minorities, religious freedom, whether it's in Hong Kong or China more broadly? Or does the church keep a low profile and stay low key to try not to imperil the growth of Chinese Christian communities? It's not an easy call. There's an argument that can be made either way. And a lot of churches will try to split the difference. They'll try to nuance it, to finesse that question. But anyway, I'll conclude simply by saying that whether we're talking about this from a political standpoint or from a religious standpoint, it's not easy to chart a path of Western response, to figure out what would genuinely be helpful in this situation, as opposed to just feel-good moral posturing. It's one thing to say, #StandWithHongKong. But what does that mean? Whether you're a policymaker in the United States or whether you're an American Christian who cares about this situation, how do you #StandWithHongKong? What does that mean from a practical standpoint of action? And we have to ask ourselves very carefully, what is it either as policymakers or as believers that we can do that will genuinely improve the situation, as opposed to simply making ourselves feel better for saying something and perhaps not improving the situation on the ground? All right, thank you very much.
We have some time for questions, and I'm sure they have all kinds of disagreements and discussion, but that's going to happen over a beer, as I said. But now is the time for all of us, for the audience. Now, we actually have two mics set up here. So I would like to ask you to just come up to the mic and stand in line. As you stand in line, and then I'll simply point to you and get your questions. And depending on how many people there are, we may actually collect all the questions before we answer them, or we may be able to answer them one by one. Also, if you could just direct your question to a particular speaker, that would be helpful in terms of getting a response. I see one here and then two here. All right, please.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to appreciate for all the information that I got from the last hour. I truly enjoy all the content from our distinguished panel speakers here. I do have two questions for Dr. Gong here. The very first one is, I really like your theory about how Hong Kong should change its role to obtain a new social image. And my question is, do you believe there is another need for another change theoretically or even theologically for us to change the imagery of Chinese government, like Communist Party? Well, we have some imagery from the Bible that we're calling that in the future there might be the dragon. As the Bible describes that, shall we regard as Communist Party by any chance changing to that kind of imagery in the future? As in political words, we're describing something like the rising of neo-Fascism as a potential possibility. So this is my first question.
That might be a bit long. So
Okay. Yes.
I think you can, Dr. Kong, maybe you can answer that question first, and then we'll go to the other side,
okay.
if that's okay with you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. Well, what I'm thinking here is talking about the social imaginary, according to what Charles Taylor definition. So what I mean is that when we are talking about the one country, two system in Hong Kong, it seems to me that it is not just only a matter of legal issue, because a lot of the people talking about it is a legal issue, whether we should start this issue from one country or from two systems and something like that. But it seems to me that there is a more in-depth issue behind this. So this is what I call the social imaginary. So in other words, that the one country, two system is not just a legal issue, but there is a kind of social imaginary shaping how one country, two system should be understood and practiced. That's my whole argument here. Now, my understanding here is that according to my research and observation, the Chinese government seems to me is still using the metaphor of parent and child metaphor. So in other words, then when we are talking about China, well, resume the sovereignty over Hong Kong, this is a legal statement. But in practice, the Chinese government would not use this resume the sovereignty, the term, but use the word return. The Hong Kong is going to return the homeland. 回歸 is return to the homeland. So the government picked up this kind of word to describe the relationship between China and Hong Kong. It's not from a legal perspective, but in terms of a parent and child metaphor. And because of this metaphor, the people the mother is always carrying the child, always hope to embrace the child. And the child is always hoping to return to homeland. So such kind of relationship. And this kind of relationship is very, very Confucius way of understanding. So in other words, that the people in Hong Kong have to listen, have to obey to what the government has said. Such kind of shaping our way of understanding. Now, my observation, maybe you are going to argue it's not true, but I just give you a very recent example. In June, when the chief executive of Hong Kong, Ms. Carrie Lam, and she made a public statement responding to what is going on to Hong Kong. What does she say? She said, as a mother of Hong Kong, sometimes my children, they are naughty. As a mother, I will not give what they ask for. Sometimes they need to have a lesson so that they can behave well. It surprised me. She used the term as a mother of Hong Kong, just a repeating such kind of the metaphor, parent-child metaphor, is so deeply embedded into the life of the Chinese politics. Now, not going into depth here, what I'm trying to argue saying that such kind of parent-child metaphor shaping the social imaginary of the Chinese government and Hong Kong is no longer works, because the people in Hong Kong no longer see ourselves as child. So we need to look for something else. And the Chinese government also need to develop something else. So that that's what I say, it is not just only a legal document, but we need to have a new kind of social imaginary to think about how we can live together, not just stick on the old social imaginary.
Can I come back to you once I have a chance to clear this line here? Okay, please.
Yes. So I actually have many questions, but since I'm hungry and
Please keep it short.
okay.
They're
So I
hungry
have a
too.
question for Gong Sang, and I have a question for Professor Wilson. So for Gong Sang, when you were stating the fact of the protest in Hong Kong, seems like you are pushing a tone that setting up, pushing the protest and the government or the police against each other by stating that the protest was being pressed or beaten somewhat by the police. So can you also explain the fact that some police got knifed in the neck by the protest, and some police got off from work and they got thrown by the gas bomb and were trying to get murdered by the protest? Or even you said they don't have anything. Can you explain the arrow, the brick, the gas bomb? And even if they really don't have anything, can you explain how or why they would expose all the police or many police, including their families' private information online, including address and all other information? What I was trying to say is only the government pushing to this kind of situation, or the protest should take some sort of responsibility?
Okay, let's answer that question first.
Okay,
I know you have a second question for Dr. Wilson, but if you can hold on to that, so we can actually have a chance for everybody.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. What you have said so far is right. It's right. Now, as I said at the very beginning, I would see the current political movement in Hong Kong right now, I would use the word secular Messianic movement. It is a secular, so it has a lot of limitations, a lot of defects. I'm not trying to romanticize what is going on in Hong Kong, even though I'm more sympathetic with the protesters. But as what you have said, there is something wrong there. That's true. Now, but before, I would like to fully agree to what you have said so far. I just want to point out 3 points here. At the very beginning of the protests in Hong Kong, starting from June, I think up to July 21st, the people in Hong Kong, the protesters, always saying that the police are the scapegoat. So it is the responsibility of the government. It has to respond to the people. But the Hong Kong government failed to do it. And what the Hong Kong government does is to push the police going into the front line to confront to the protester. So that's why before July 21st, I tell you, the people in Hong Kong stand on the side of the police, saying that they are the scapegoat. They do not want to do what they are asked to do, but they are paid for that, so they have no choice. So they are the scapegoat. So when you go back to the history and you look at all the, about the news, about the words in the Facebook by the protester, we always consider that the police are the scapegoat. Okay, that's the first point. And the second point is that, as I mentioned also in my presentation, on July 21st, this is a turning point, because on that day, well, you can go to the website to see a lot. The ordinary people are attacked by the white shirt people. And even though I'm not staying in Yuen Long, 2 hours ago, I also received a WhatsApp from some of my friends saying that don't go to Yuen Long, there will be something happen. As an ordinary people, I also received such kind of WhatsApp. How can we say that the police does not know what is going on? So that's why there is a very strong belief among the people in Hong Kong on that attack on the ordinary people. It is not just only someone against the protester, but such kind of against the protester got the permission and endorsement from the police, because the police got the news and then they were not there. They were late for 40 minutes. They said, no, we do not wait late for 40 minutes. We only were late for 39 minutes. And then there are 2 police there. A lot of video has shown us that. And they see what happened, they turn away. So this changed the attitude of the relationship between the police and also the people in Hong Kong. So I just want to tell you the historical fact. Now, the third point, I would say, how can we solve the tension or dilemma or even some kind of misunderstanding between the police and the demonstrator and the protester? The only way to solve it is to set up an independent inquiry commission. Not only look at what the police have done, but also look at what the protesters have done to set up such kind of independent commission. And such kind of independent inquiry commission is not standing on the side of the police, not standing at the side of the protester. This is an independent. Then we can look at all this matter whether to see whether the police have done something wrong or whether the protester have done something wrong. We need to have such kind of full-scale independent investigation. That is the only way to solve the problem. But unfortunately, until right now, the government refused to do it. And also the police say to the government openly, you can see it from all the websites, and the police say to the government, we do not need to have an independent inquiry commission. Well, it is a little bit strange to me, because if the police are brutally beaten or attacked by the protester, we need such kind of independent inquiry commission to look at what is really happening. Unfortunately, as I say, both the government as well as the police, they refuse to do it. If so, then such kind of accusation to one another will still keep on and go on and go on without any way out. So that's what I would like to respond. Thank you very much.
I see this gentleman standing here, so I'm going to give you a chance, and then we'll go back to that side. All right? I want to be fair to everybody to actually have a chance to raise the questions. If I can also ask you to keep your questions short, and also the answers short. Okay? Please.
Is it him?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
First off, I'd like to thank the Perkins School for hosting such an event like this, especially when a unique opportunity in the midst of the protests going on, 20th week that it's going on. So a lot of the times we're stuck talking about things in the past, but this is still very prescient and very, very important to nowadays. I have so many questions, but I think I'll limit it to one for now. And to the panel, but I guess specifically Dr. Kung, I would say that we're starting to see some ramifications of the Hong Kong protest movement in the wider international sphere. So just today in Iraq, there were some announcements that the protesters there, who have suffered over 100 deaths, I believe, at this point in the most recent round of protests, have come together and stipulated that they have 26 demands for their government that they're going to try to press for, and that will eventually that they were trying to agitate for. I believe that there are similar sorts of tactics being practiced, I know in Catalonia for the Catalonian independence, and also in Lebanon. There's other protests that have emerged recently in Ecuador and Chile. So my question, and this relates to your thesis, is does the sort of embodiment of this like wider rejection of the Hong Kong government and this sort of this undercurrent form of protests, like, is it something that is limited in space to Hong Kong alone, or could it grow beyond and become more of an international movement where you see a lot more of participation from just the broader public in a sort of identification with what happened and what started 20 weeks ago?
If I could ask you to do a quick answer, and then I'm going to collect all the questions from the remaining questioners. All right? Then we can actually have a collective conversation.
Okay, a quick answer is that I would say what is happening right now in Hong Kong should be understood from the globalization perspective. So that is to say, what is going on in Hong Kong should be counted as one of the global social movement. So in other words, that it is very obvious in Hong Kong. For instance, like we're not only talking about the local issues here, we try our best to translate what has been happening in Hong Kong in different languages in different parts of the world, and also advertise in their newspaper to let the whole world know, so that we can join hands together to do something else. So I found that, to a certain extent, such kind of global civil movement is, I can't say it's very effective, but it's going well. We let what other people know what is going on. And I hope that, maybe one day, when what is happening right now in Hong Kong have passed, Hong Kong can also show similar solidarity with people happening right now in Indonesia, in Kashmir, something like that, So what I'm thinking is that some kind of global civil movement or society is forming and is emerging. Yeah.
Thank you.
As I said, I'm going to collect all the questions now before the answers, all right? So I'm going to go to the young lady to my left.
So my question is actually for Dr. Takeuchi, and it's a little bit more in the economics terms of the things that are going on in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong seems to be a very crucial part of Chinese economics, and that the protests do cause some economic instability for Hong Kong, for China in general. And my question is, in face of the trade wars and perhaps continuation or increase of the trade wars, is it feasible to believe that the trade wars can have an impact on how China responds to the protests, trying to bring some more stability on that side? So a causation or a consequence of what is going on with the U.S. itself.
Thank you. I think what I saw is the next person, this lady down here, and then we'll go to the right side. Please, yes.
我想问一下，我用中文来表达了，来说一下。我知道你听得懂中文，你不觉得你那个 presentation 是在说谎吗 ？You are a liar.
The answer is I'm going to use Chinese. Don't you think your presentation is in fact a lie?
你们有一个小孩，他刚那个升到地面的时候，他是一张空白的纸，他不知道是对还是错。现在呢，是一帮 young gay 他们要上街，你觉得他们是自己上街的呢，还是背后有人怂恿他们去上街的呢？
These young people being motivated by other things or asked by outsiders to go on the street, or these young people, these little, I think you said little child, 小孩, these little children really don't have any sense of right or wrong. I am paraphrasing at the end. Is that the question? Okay.
我就是想问一下，你们在号称说是在保护那一帮 young gay， 为什么你们会把他推到前面去，而你们站在后边呢？
Why do the middle-aged and older people push the young kids to the front while you guys stay in the back? Okay, so I'm going to go to this side. The man in blue, the second person.
First, let alone describe of the real protest or whatever it is. I appreciate the way you think that we are going to sit down and figure out the solution to solve this problem. First, as a Chinese, I agree with this point of your presentation, let alone what you talked about is true or not true. But my real question is for Professor, I'm sorry I didn't catch your name, but about the Christian part. You know, I'm just new to American culture. I'm starting to learn.
Dr. Wilson, is that right?
Yeah,
the last
yeah,
speaker?
I think it is. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm sorry to.
No, it's good.
I just been here and started to learn Bible, learn Christian,
Yeah.
and I appreciate the way that you think that you love all the people. You like the freedom of speech. But you know what? Most Chinese are really sensitive to the way that if you are not a Chinese, you talk about our politics. That's what I'm really worried about, because you know what? If they didn't learn about Bible, they didn't learn about what you are thinking. And you know the truth is we don't have this high level of democracy you have here. So many would think this would like bring hatred between the people of Americans, and I know everyone I meet already in America is extremely friendly to me, and I trust them. And the thing is, my friends started to think that Americans are like they are doing things to our politics. How can they do such things? You know what? This is what I'm worrying about. Which would I'm a little bit nervous. So
it's okay. If you can formulate that into a question, that would be great.
Yeah. The question is, would you consider the influence among the real people, preventing them to understand each other because you did some political things to China which they don't want you to do?
Okay, all right. I think Anthony's next, and then the man in black, I think would be the last, but I do know that I've given the first two speakers the chance to ask their questions as well, so I'm going to honor that. Please.
I'll try to be quick. So thank you all. Just a quick couple items. So in Hong Kong, only 12% of the population is Christian. So how does this apply to the other 88%? Or is this a question of the normalization of Christianity as a theological statement as to how to move forward? Within the comments about Christianity in China, the Chinese Constitution from 1981, Section 36 states that there's a freedom of religion, but it's of freedom of normal religion. I think the word there is cheng, right? So the issue there then is how does this all apply? The other question then is, do you see this then in the larger context of Chinese history? If you go back to the 1630s and 1640s and the ascent of the Qing dynasty, and you had Hong Taiji coming and taking over, there was for 267 years there was revolt and protest and conflict about Qing legitimacy, Manchu legitimacy, and the question was more not so much about democracy or about politics, though politics was involved, but it was a question of ethnicity, of minzu, of identity, which is in other parts, as you mentioned, in China right now.
Could you formulate that into a question?
That's the question. Quickly? Like, how is that? Can you look at it in that long view? That's the question.
Okay,
yeah.
Perfect. The man in black.
Hey, I just have a questions for Dr. Kong. So, you know how, like, from my understanding, the one country, two system only lasts for 50 years for Hong Kong people. So, are you guys protesting for all of this just to become Chinese in like 27 years, 28 maybe?
28.
Or you guys just are you guys just fighting to lose in the end?
Okay. I did promise the first two speakers to ask the questions, so please do so. Again, please keep it short. All right?
Thank you. It's going to be short. So my question is, do you believe introducing theology into this debate will initiate a new battleground of ideology in the future?
Okay. Yes, please.
So I kind of like...
Your second question, I think you had a
yes.
second question to Dr. Wilson.
This question is to Dr. Wilson.
Yes. Yes.
So I kind of like rephrased the person just said about democracy, and like when you mentioned America as like a model of democracy, and when you see the American flag in the protest, whatever, and I think freedom of speech certainly it's one of the freedom, the democracy, right? But certainly, even if the most freedom country, America, there's some certain things that you can't just easily criticize. For example, race problem, gun problem, abortion, probably. And shouldn't the democracy work differently under different countries' context? For example, what I'm saying is probably like some issue in China, it's probably as the same level as race problem in America. But you guys don't know, you guys don't want to learn, or you guys don't know the differences between each two countries, and you still want to enforce the same model into another country. Would that fit? Or, that's my question. Would the democracy fit? Because he said America has a higher democracy. I would say has a different democracy in different countries' context.
Okay, I think you made your question very clear, and I think you understand the question, right? I'm going to give the last question to the man in green. You're the last person standing. So please do. Again, please keep it short.
Yeah. First, I need to thank you, all the speakers. And I want to ask Dr. Wilson that I heard that U.S. Senate just passed the Hong Kong Human Rights Bill, or Hong Kong Human Rights Act, something like that. But what made me confused is that I think some politicians use, because Hong Kong is a different, I would say custom area or a tax area than mainland China, because it's because Donald Trump he added tariff to mainland China, but the tariff didn't apply to Hong Kong, right? So the U.S. Senate passed the Hong Kong Human Rights Bill. A lot of critics say that they're gonna cancel the Hong Kong distinct status as another tax area or custom area, will it help to protect Hong Kong people or hurt Hong Kong economy?
Okay, we have all the questions, and we're going to spend the next 4 hours here, okay, to solve all these questions, and they're going to all write learned papers and articles to answer all this. If I could just ask you to just stay for 10 more minutes, we'll give them a chance. Is that okay? But if you have to leave, then please do so. I think the first, well, Dr. Kong, since you're the speaker, keep your answers short and succinct and persuasive. How about that?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for all the questions as well as the comments. You know, I have to confess that I may not be able to give you a reasonable response, but I try my best, you know. Now, concerning whether what I'm saying is lie or not, I think this is something related to the understanding of truth. If we say our understanding of truth is based on two criteria, the first one is corresponding theory to the truth. So that is corresponding to what is really happening. And the second criteria is talking about coherence theory of truth. So even though we may not be able to look at what is happening outside, but the whole argument itself, whether it is consistent or not. Now, I do not want to go into details here, but I would like to say that if you are trying to say that what I'm trying to say is not true, is lie, then I think you have to go through this true theory to assess all my arguments, whether it is corresponding, whether it is coherence. Okay, the first point. Now, the second point is that whether, you know, the young people are brainwashed or indoctrinated, I think the question is important because of our experience during the time of the Cultural Revolution in 1960 and up to the mid of 1970s. A lot of the young people, you know, in Chinamen and, you know, they're holding the red books, you know, then we have to ask, maybe because of this kind of experience, then we are very suspicious of any movement coming from the young people. They are indoctrinated or they are brainwashed, you know. Maybe, I'm not quite sure, is this something related to our previous experience? And in fact, you know, in the nowadays, when in the last few years, you can see that a lot of the social movement are initiated by the young people, like the Malala from Pakistan, and also Greta from Sweden talking about the ecology. They bring new hopes to our society. How can we say to those people, oh, Malala, you are brainwashed, you are indoctrinated, you know, Greta, you are... I don't think we will say in this way because they play a very important role in our society. Young people, they are no longer young. They are more mature than what we think. That is, we have to put our faith on young people, rather still saying that they are too young, they are not able to, you know, to think thoughtfully. And the last point here, and also now, when we are talking about the young people in Hong Kong, and also a friend mentioned that, you know, Hong Kong, the one country, two system will come to an end in the 2047. So about less than 30 years. For the middle age, like me, I'm at the age of 50 something. Well, I'm not sure whether I will in the 2047, I will still survive. But it is very clear for the young people, their calculation is much better than us. They are thinking that I'm only a teenager at the age of maybe 20 or less than. 30 years later, I'm only at the age of 40 something or 50. I still have a long way to go. If I do not do something right now, after 2047, what is my future? So I just want to let you know in this way. And the final one, that when you are talking, saying that the middle-aged people, you know, their way of defending the young people, they are not going to the front line. I will tell you this is not true. Well, then you can go to the website to know more about whether the information is misinformation or not. That is so important here. And the final comment making about whether when we start to think the whole issue in theology, whether it is pushing the whole battle into another ideological battle. But you can also argue from a different way. The ideological battle is already be there. We haven't started another one. What we are doing is the ideological battle. So that is to say, if we are different from one another, if we are holding different views, please come down. We can discuss, we can explore, we can have a dialogue instead of just sticking, you know, sticking on the ideology that we have hold in the previous year. So in other words, that I would say that the theological engagement is not necessarily starting a new battle, but is to admit the battle is already be there, but we should discuss this in a rational way, positive way, and a dialogical way. Yeah, thank you.
To quote Carl Schmitt, all politics are theological. Yes, yeah. I think Dr. Takeuchi was the next person addressed. So please answer the question that was raised to you.
Okay. So I think that the question is about how current U.S. administration's policy of trade war influences Xi Jinping's response to Hong Kong. And the shortest answer is it would have a negative impact on Xi Jinping's response to Hong Kong. The reason is, we means that Americans often misunderstand that Xi Jinping is really focusing on how to handle U.S.-China trade war. And then it is true that the U.S. relationship with the United States is the most important relationship, international relationship for China. But point is, for Xi Jinping, the most important thing is domestic stability. So he has to think about many issues before thinking about the most important international relations. So he has to think about the political struggle in elite politics. He has to think about how to manage the local politics and then make sure that the central-local relationship is for local governments following the central order. And then third, state-society relations. There are so many groups of the people in China who have dissatisfaction with the current situation, namely farmers, workers, and ethnic minorities. And so Chinese government has to make them at least satisfied enough with the regime so that they would not start protest. And then next is Hong Kong. So actually Hong Kong and Taiwan are actually the different issues from international relations. So, so for Xi Jinping, the priority is really Hong Kong is more important than the relationship with the United States. So now Trump is really giving the pressure to Xi Jinping administration. So it's like, from the Xi Jinping's perspective, it's like, one more troubles are added. But still, it's more important to maintain the stability in Hong Kong. And then it's a very difficult thing. One thing that I would add is actually the current US policy towards China is really empowering nationalists in the elite politics of Beijing. And then this is actually a bad news for Beijing because nationalists are facing the internationalists. And the internationalists are the ones who are really appreciate the more cooperative foreign policy. So in that sense, now internationalists in Beijing are very really undermined because of the Trump's policy toward China. And then so in that sense, so overall, I think that the US-China trade war has a negative impact on Xi Jinping's options to handle protests in Hong Kong.
Dr. Wilson with the last words.
Okay, so first of all, let me just very quickly thank everybody for coming tonight on behalf of the Center for Faith and Learning. We're really pleased to sponsor, co-sponsor this event. Thank you very much. And just to let you know, if you'd like to be kept apprised of our future programs, there's a sign-up sheet outside on the wooden table out there, so feel free to sign up and put yourself on our mailing list. Now, with regard to the questions that I was asked, I think we have to be very careful about ascribing human rights activism and protest to outside agitators. Right? This is a common tactic that authoritarian regimes all over the world use and have used. I am a native of the American South, and the frequent line that was used by racially repressive governments in the American South was that everything is fine here if you just understand our customs and our values and our history and our way of life. you would understand that that's how it needs to be here, and it's just outside agitators that are coming in with their perspectives causing problems. That, with all due respect, was a morally bankrupt response in 1955, and it's a morally bankrupt response in 2019. Now, that's not to say that there doesn't need to be sensitivity to the cultural and historical circumstances of particular places. And addressing one of the questions, I'm very sensitive to the idea that a lot of people in China, because of the legacy of Western imperialism, because of the legacy of cultural domination, will respond negatively to attempts to influence Chinese culture and society coming from the West. But that cannot, in and of itself, serve as a reason for people in the West to simply stay silent about anything that happens in China. That can't be used as just the go-to way to shut down discussion and criticism and debate. So I think we have to be very careful about that sort of thing. But as I said, we have to be sensitive to that historical and cultural legacy. And people who criticize the practices anywhere should do it with a sense of historical knowledge, contextual understanding. People should not speak from a position of ignorance. Last thing, I was asked about, might democracy look different in different places? To a certain degree, obviously, yes. Right? Some countries have presidential systems, some countries have parliamentary systems. Some countries have different fundamental rights that are enshrined in their Bill of Rights. In the United States, we say that the right to keep and bear arms is a fundamental right. A lot of other democratic societies don't agree with that. Okay? There are differences institutionally from country to country. But I would point out that the person who asked me the question said, well, look, there are controversial issues in the United States. There's abortion, there's gun control, there's race relations. There's a difference between an issue being controversial and someone being prohibited from raising the issue. All right? I can sit up here today and say anything I want to you about abortion, about gun control, about race relations. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to start pontificating about those issues. Right? But my point is, I will not be punished for whatever position I take. I will not be punished for raising the issue. We have candidates currently running for president in the United States who take the full range of positions on all of those issues. They do not fear governmental sanction. Now, their friends might disagree with them. They might face social ostracism. Their positions might be unpopular, but they're not going to be put in jail. They're not going to be denied the liberty to express whatever positions on those controversial questions they see fit. So I just think I would reject the analogy between the way that some in China would seek to put certain issues completely off limits for discussion and the fact that we certainly, like in any society, have controversial issues in the United States. Controversy is fine and exists everywhere. But censorship and the stifling of debate and discussion cannot be part of an authentically democratic society anywhere. And I would leave it at that.
There are so many... There are so many strands of conversation. I hardly know how to wrap all this up. I'm not Jesus. I don't know how to do that. But perhaps this is a wake-up call for all of us, that we need this sort of conversation more in a civil, in an orderly manner. And we hope, in fact, to continue this sort of conversation in the future. In the same kind of venue, with the same kind of spirit. I've kept you, we have kept you for 24 minutes, longer than we contracted. I said we were going to end at 8. It's now 8:25, so it's 25 minutes over. My apologies, but thank you very much for coming, and let the conversation continue.